Okay, well, good afternoon, folks, and welcome to our final TESS seminar for this semester in what's been a very eventful semester and a very eventful year and a very eventful last few years. It's great to have you here. We really appreciate you guys coming or attending our TESS seminars, and we've had very good attendance all through the course of this year, although despite the fact that we're primarily operating via Zoom, but also, of course, we have some people showing up in person here as well. And very pleased today to be having Bob Godfrey, who Katharina will introduce in just a moment. Just wanted to say a couple of things. Remember that at the end of next semester, we've got our TESS annual conference coming up, and those are always a really good event. This year we're going to have it, I think, the 3rd and 4th of November. Yoko will be in touch about that. Of course, we cover all your costs, and it's a great opportunity for everybody to hear about everyone else's research and collaborate and that type of thing. So do look forward to that, and please do put that in your calendars, the 3rd and 4th of November. Also wanted to mention that be sure to check out TESS's social media. Thanks to a lot of work from Yoko and Nina and others, we have really good social media at TESS. In our website and our Facebook pages, we have opportunities for researchers. So this can be job opportunities, fellowships, grants, all kinds of things that are hot off the press. And the second thing is, if you're publishing a paper or you're putting out a press release or you're doing something interesting about your research, please let us know. Just flick us a quick email with a URL, with a link to whatever it is you're doing, and we will then promote that out through our social media and spread it out to thousands of people. So really, we want to help you become more famous here at TESS. Anyway, it's time to turn over to Katharina, who's going to introduce our speaker. And thanks very much, everyone, for another good semester here at TESS.
Hello. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bob Godfrey today as our speaker. Bob is a research scientist at the National Australian Centre for Biodiversity Research in Canberra, and also associated with the National Research Collections Australia at CSIRO. Bob's research focus is on the conservation and management of Australia's biodiversity in broad sense, and his particular interests include the impacts of drought and fire on other extreme events on arid and semi-arid ecosystems. He's also interested in biogeography and has worked a lot on invasive species management, for example, for invasive grasses, as well as on plant genetics and evolution. Today he's going to present us his work on the implications of the 2019-2020 megafires and drought for plant conservation in Australia. Please welcome Bob. Thanks.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and I appreciate the offer to present some of our recent work. What I'm hoping to do is just give a bit of an overview of some of the research projects that I and some of my colleagues here at CSIRO have been involved in for the last 2 or 3 years, I suppose. So comes as no surprise to everybody, I guess, that drought and megafires and other extreme events are very much in the news. I took this photograph on my drive home about a year and a half ago. That's sort of a social meme for you. And I think it's well-placed concern because extreme events are certainly increasing, I think, in severity and frequency in Australia and globally. I think there's quite good evidence for that. And it is of some concern from the perspective of the conservation biologist, I think, because extreme events are associated with unusual and unpredictable phenomena, particularly nonlinear processes and rapid state transitions. They have many characteristics of complex adaptive systems, I guess you would say. And so it makes them difficult to understand and untangle. And so I think a lot of the work that we've been doing recently has been trying to get at some of the questions that emerge from the impact of extreme events on Australian vegetation in particular. So I'll try to cover some of those topics today. This is a photograph that I took towards the end of last year. I don't know how many of you get down this way, but this was in central New South Wales at the end of 2019. And it shows a very severe drought underway, which had been going for about 3 years at this point. And so that alone would be a very significant driver of ecological change, and I'll get into why. But it also shows a lot of smoke haze in the background. That smoke haze is from the megafires, in particular from the fire in Woolamai National Park and vicinity, which was more than 100 kilometers away. So when I drove through there, it was incredibly thick. And at certain times, your visibility was reduced just to a few kilometers. So this is a coincidence of events that's quite unusual. And so I think that one characteristic of conditions in the future is that we would start to see more and more very unusual events co-occurring. And that has quite significant implications for vegetation and wildlife in general, I suppose. Now, taking a step back, I think that quite like these images that are produced by NASA, that photograph was taken towards the center of the image. I'm not sure if you can see a cursor, but just to the left of the red box. And that red box shows the fires in Woolamai to the north and Canangara Boyd region to the south, all just to the west of Sydney. Each of those fires were immense in size. But to the north, you can see fires burning in northeastern New South Wales, and then all the way up to southern Queensland. And you can see smoke from the bushfires in Victoria, eastern Victoria, and southern New South Wales. This was taken in January 4th, 2020. And that smoke actually went around to encircle the globe several times. What I think is very interesting about this photograph, though, is that it shows, well, it's a satellite image, I should say, is that it also shows other processes at play that have led to very significant implications for the vegetation along the East Coast. One of them being a subcontinental scale drought, which was one of the worst on record. And you can see that the drought was very severe right to coastal areas. And even in the absence of the fires, that was going to have a very substantial impact. And it also shows that the landscape that we're dealing with has been drastically modified by land clearing and increasingly by urban encroachment. You can actually see in the right-hand image there the expansion of the urban metropolitan area of Sydney. So we are dealing with a conjunction of unusual events, and it just struck me that the eastern seaboard was primarily the area where you had green vegetation left in the eastern half of the continent. And after the fires, there was this great browning of the landscape. So certainly an unusual event. I'd just like to back up a little before we talk about the fires. Katerina, I think, was originally interested in having a talk about those, and we've done work together on the fires. But I think that something that's been forgotten here is that there was an extremely severe drought across New South Wales and Queensland, and indeed a lot of the continent, just prior to the fires. I think that it's the implications of this drought are still playing out, especially in burnt areas. But I'd like to just talk about some of the implications of that and some work that we've done on historical reconstruction of droughts to understand the implications of them. So there was a very severe drought between 2017 and 2019 across, I guess, the eastern part of the continent. And you can see lowest on record rainfall, particularly in northeastern New South Wales and far south, southeastern Queensland. And that's a biodiversity hotspot with Gondwandan rainforests and a lot of other communities that are highly speciose. So that's a significant event. And there were also very protracted periods of very high temperatures, such that maximum temperatures over the preceding year leading up to middle 2019 were running at anywhere between 1.5 and up to about 3 degrees above normal. So these are conditions that are quite extreme. And I don't know if you get into central New South Wales, but just so that you can kind of be aware of the severity of the drought that was taking place prior to the fires. This was taken actually in the middle of 2019, prior to the onset of the fires, and the landscape was being ravaged by drought. It's a little bit difficult to see, but in the background, Eucalyptus albans and other eucalypt species are losing their canopy, and indeed there was quite a bit of mortality beginning to occur in the woody vegetation, and of course total loss of the understory and immense amounts of soil loss as well. So it was a very severe drought, and I think in this location probably the worst since the 1940s. And just anecdotally, obviously COVID has thrown a spanner in the works, but I actually have a property up in that region, and I found on my property hundreds and hundreds of dead kangaroos during that drought that had died slow death from starvation, but in the end, lack of water killed them. And it wasn't just grey kangaroos, it was a whole range of macropod species that all died. And the impacts on wildlife were immense. They were so large that I actually used a front end loader to scrape up a lot of the dead kangaroos. I don't have a photo of that for you, but it was a very serious event, and one that I had not seen myself in that region before. Now on the right hand side, that just to give you an idea of the severity of conditions for wildlife, that's a Eucalyptus albans tree, a white box, and you can see that wildlife had been digging along this exposed root, which had sort of been eroded away, and they were tearing off the bark, trying to get at the last of the moisture. So these conditions had been developing for at least a year, in my experience in that area. And I think that that it will become apparent over time as more research is done that the drought itself would have had a catastrophic effect on wildlife and vegetation in northeastern New South Wales, even in the absence of the fires. But that was the condition that, as they were in mid to late 2019. So this was just a modern example of a phenomenon which has been going on in Australia now, well since settlement and for a long time prior to that. I have been interested myself in trying to understand the lessons from prior droughts like this for the long-term conservation of Australian vegetation. And several years ago, we had the idea of investigating the impact of the Federation drought on vegetation and animal populations across the continent. The Federation drought itself is mostly known from its impact in Eastern Australia between 1895 and 1903. But it was sort of a longer general period of dryness, particularly in Western Australia, starting in about 1891. And I think it would be fair to say it was the most extensive and severe drought since European settlement, and possibly considerably before. Not in every location, but at the continent as a whole, it was exceptionally severe. And our work uncovered that there was very good evidence for collapse and widespread mortality of flora and fauna, all the way from arid to temperate biomes, even up into coastal areas in some places. Now, I think that this was largely lost to time in a way, until the millennium drought in the early 2000s got people starting to think about the impact of these enormous droughts on Australian vegetation and plant and wildlife. So we thought that we would go back and reconstruct this event by looking at taking it from newspaper records and other accounts from the time. From that, we were able to construct, I think, would quantify as well as we could based on, acknowledging that it's historical information, the processes that were involved in during this drought and how it affected Australian ecosystems. There were certainly very substantial impacts across the continent, except tropical areas. And I think that one of the key outcomes of the work was to show that it was sort of a bottom-up process. It really started with vegetation, and then over time, as the drought progressed, it progressed through wildlife and through lower trophic levels, through herbivores and so on, all the way up into mesopredator guilds. But it did not tend to affect the highest, the large predators in the landscape generally, and that's because of an enormous abundance of carrion in the landscape. So scavengers and predators did okay, but everything else was severely impacted. And an interesting interaction that occurred was in Western New South Wales, parts of South Australia, I guess, and also Victoria, where rabbits were in plague numbers at the time. And the overgrazing by rabbits on native vegetation really produced a collapse of those systems across that region. And in fact, a step change really in the state of those ecosystems, such that they have never really recovered. So this was a very severe event, and some interesting results that I was not really predicting until we really dug into it a little bit further. Another feature of that drought was that it revealed that conditions develop slowly at first, and you can see almost no change in the landscape under drought that may last for several years. But then as a certain threshold is reached, and then you get a dramatic increase in stress and mortality of woody vegetation and also wildlife occurring. When that occurs does depend on where you are in the country, but generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is if you're in an area that's been subjected to drought where rainfall is about half or less than normal, and that's been sustained for 2 years, say, on the coast to about 5 or 6 years inland, then that's about the tipping point where you start to see drastic impacts that can occur. So you can read about that in the paper, but it's some interesting, I found it quite interesting. And I was lucky enough to track down an old photograph of 1903 here. This is in Naranda in central New South Wales. And I think this really encapsulates what happened during the Federation drought. It was really the culmination of a series of devastating processes that culminated in these tremendous dust storms, wind erosion, and a very much impoverished landscape that we see today. And some recent work, I think, has demonstrated that the Federation drought here, and there was a drought slightly prior to that as well, it led to a step change in wind erosion and the state of Western landscapes in the semi-arid zone. Only in the 2000s did that begin to recover. This is a graph of wind erosion and dust deposition. But since 2000, and with the advent of the millennium drought and more recent droughts, there has been an increase in dust again. And so that rainfall that we had, high rainfall in the late 1900s, 1980s and 1990s, seems to have ended, and we may well be looking at more cases like this again. So the implications of this are quite significant. As I said, 2 to 5 years is a pretty good estimate of how long it might be until you start seeing significant impacts in the landscape. On the left is conditions as they stood towards the end of 2019 at the just when the fires were getting started, and I will be talking about the fires. But what that shows is that rainfall was lower than 50% over much of northern New South Wales, southwest Queensland, much of South Australia for 2 years prior to that. And indeed, 2017 itself was mostly dry. So we are at the critical point here where vegetation will start to be affected, I think. And I've showed you the impact on wildlife as well. So things were looking quite severe, and I was doing media work around the Federation drought paper at around the same time, and predicting that we could see substantial woody plant death in northern New South Wales. And then fire predictions were being produced by the bushfire CRC that were suggesting chances of a severe fire season ahead, particularly on the East Coast. So I guess the rest is history. There were a lot of major fires all up and down the coast, and I will get into this, but I arrived after the Christmas holidays, and a colleague of mine said, why don't we try to start mapping these fires, and with the ultimate goal of trying to understand what impact they might have on Australian vegetation. We're lucky enough to work here in the National Research Collections, which houses herbarium specimens, and we're part of associated with the Atlas of Living Australia and the Australasian Virtual Herbarium, which houses specimen data records. So we have that already in-house, but we needed to come up with a way of generating fire maps quickly. And so we thought that a good option would be to use satellite hotspot data, which are freely available here on the Geoscience Australia website. So the fires, as I get onto, they really occurred between the 1st of July 2019 and 11th of February 2020. We downloaded data for that time frame, and there was data from more than 3 million hotspots. So we then, and I'm not going to get into all the detail here, but you can have a read about it if you like, but the crux of it is that you can access this historical hotspot data, which contains point locations for fire records, satellite and sensors which detected it, a range of other estimates, including confidence bands and temperature for some satellites. We then cleaned that data and filtered it to remove spurious records. And we had to filter at a certain temperature to eliminate false positives, and it's all documented, but that was a process that had to happen. But ultimately, we ended up with Australia-wide fire layers out of that. Daily ones, actually. You can get them down to a very fine time resolution if you want to. So I have two things to show you. One of them is a map, a cumulative fire map over the entire period of the bushfires, and also a daily animation, which shows you how they developed over time. This is a figure that we published in our paper there. Katerina is a co-author with us on this. There was about 40 million hectares burnt between July 2019 and February 2020. Most of that was in the tropics, which is of course not unusual. I'm sure you've seen all that before. Not particularly hot fires, but compared to the southeast, but nonetheless very extensive. We also had some significant fires in WA and on Kangaroo Island, and other authors have looked at those. Our focus was on the southeastern megafires, and so most of my talk is about those. This, I guess, is probably fairly familiar to you now. A lot of people have looked at the fires, but just to give you a bit of an idea about the spatial distribution of the fires and the size of them. There were at least 11 fires that were more than 100,000 hectares in extent. Now, in many places, 100,000 hectares is considered a tremendously huge fire, but 100,000 hectares barely rated a mention during these fires. There were 11 that were more than that, but there were multiple fires that were over 1 million hectares in extent. And then there was this very large sort of super complex of fires in the northeastern part of New South Wales, which was 2.6 million hectares or almost 7 million acres in extent. And there were a great many fires that were 50 to 100,000 hectares, which under normal seasons would be quite significant, such as the Capitar fire or Hanging Rock fire, many others that, well, they were barely even noticed. I mean, I guess if you lived right there, they were. But from the perspective of the southeast at large, the scale of the fires was really quite incredible. Now I have an animation here. Let's hope this works. Yes. Okay. Actually, I've come in part of the way through, so it's a good opportunity to just describe what's happening here. We have daily fire maps here. So this is, as this ticker continues through, it goes over time and it shows the development of the fires on a daily basis. There's a ticker on the top left there that says species. That is the number of species based on our herbarium records, which I'll get into in a moment, in which half of their known distribution is burnt. So within individual days, you're gaining dozens of species where half of their populations were burnt at one time. On the right-hand side, we've just got a couple examples of major vegetation types that were affected. Rainforest, particularly in the northeast, eucalyptus forests in the southeast, but there were many vegetation types that were affected. This should restart. Okay, so this is beginning in July. It's quite unusual, but even in July, there were fires beginning in northern New South Wales, but you can see a gradual population of fires in the north. And then I think that the fire season really became quite severe and people were beginning to get very worried about it in September. The fires were described in October in northern New South Wales as sort of apocalyptic, but they were certainly very, very extensive. And then fires began to develop west of Sydney. That's the Woolamai fire that you can see there. Canangra Boyd is below that. And then in January, a rapid development of fires in the southeast. So it's an interesting animation just to help you kind of envisage how the fires developed over time. And I can go back to this slide here. Now, as I mentioned, the vegetation, we looked at we lost about, well, let's see, something like 7.3 million hectares of woody vegetation, particularly eucalyptus forests and woodlands, and another perhaps 300,000 hectares of rainforest were affected during the fires, and around 10.5 million hectares were burnt in the southeast. That did include some areas that were not native vegetation, but I wanted to put this into historical context for you. The scale of the fires is really unprecedented, I guess, since early settlement times at the very least. There was a series of very extensive fires in 1851 in Victoria that were around 5 million hectares in extent. I think that's probably the largest that has occurred prior to the Black Summer fires. Some of the more recent fires that you might have heard of in Victoria, New South Wales, that caused significant loss of life were maybe up to about 2 to 3 million hectares. You may also hear about some fires that occurred in this region in the 1970s and in the 1950s. They were quite extensive, but they mostly affected the pastoral regions and particularly more semi-arid and dry regions. And they occurred after wet periods, not after dry periods. So the argument has been made that fire seasons in the 1970s were particularly immense and huge, but they didn't affect the same vegetation. So one has to be careful when looking at the specific vegetation types affected to determine whether we can say that things were unprecedented or not. But I think that at least within the last 200 years, the scale of the Black Summer fires was unprecedented in southeastern forests. And not to get into great detail here, you can have a read about it if you like, but there's about 7.3 million hectares of eucalyptus forests and woodlands burnt across multiple bioregions in the southeast. Our estimate is that 330,000 hectares of rainforest and vine thickets were burnt. Those are of particular interest because there are Gondwanan species in there that are of high conservation value and are generally quite diverse systems. And so I will say that some of the estimates of these they're very dependent on, of course, on the shapefiles that we used. And I think there's considerable work to be done on the actual extent of rainforests, but no doubt they were very heavily affected. And in many cases, more than half of the remaining areas of rainforests were burnt in these fires, particularly in the New England tablelands and in the Northeast. But there were other vegetation types affected as well. And that study was not really set up to look at temperatures. More work has been done on that recently by other groups. But certainly there was pretty widespread, abundant evidence of very high fire temperatures and canopy loss throughout much of the burnt regions. So I wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about just how we determined the impact on vascular plant species as opposed to vegetation types using data from herbarium specimens. And many scientists have used similar information, perhaps not on this scale, but I just wanted to run through a few pitfalls with it and ways that you need to deal with this sort of information. It took us several months to clean our data, and I'd just like to share with you a few ideas on how you might go about that. So first of all, it's an enormously huge data set. It's publicly available. The image on the right shows you how you go and do that. You just go onto the AVH and you can download all the specimen records for a given polygon. In this particular case, we had almost 2 million records from southeastern Australia. That includes vascular plants, non-vascular plants, mosses, and so on, other cryptogams. The data are pretty messy. And so you can't just go ahead and use that data for species distribution modeling or anything. You really do have to get in and clean it. We are starting some programs here to do that a bit, and the Australian, the Atlas of Living Australia already does some of that, but we basically went from scratch with it. The problem with taxonomic, with herbarium specimens, is that they initially, at least, and even now, mostly collected for taxonomic purposes. I mean, they were not done in a systematic way, and the people who were collecting the specimens were not thinking about doing the kind of fine scale modeling that we're attempting today. So as a result, they have significant problems with geolocations. They're often quite imprecise, especially for older specimens. There are many incorrect original records to begin with, a lot of handling of data, so you get errors and typos. Then you've got the problems of rare species, like especially orchids, where geocodes have been altered or scrambled somewhat so that you can't go back and find them to protect them. So, and then you have glasshouse or garden plantation specimens are included, and it's not noted that they are in fact non-native populations, non-indigenous. So these are all issues to be aware of. And then you have taxonomic problems on top of that, the misidentifications and synonymy and revisions. And Katarina will know that of all the groups that we looked at, I think that 90% of the issues with taxonomy were among the orchids due to multiple levels of taxonomic work and that have been done over the years. So a lot of work to be done there still. And this is just one example on the right hand side where you can get a completely incorrect understanding of the distribution of a species if you just use the unclean data. So let's just move past that process. So this is how we clean the data. We used R and OpenRefine. And if you're not familiar with OpenRefine, I wasn't till Nunzio showed me how to use it. But it is a freely available program. It's fantastic. And you can subset and filter, clean data, change data fields en masse. And it also keeps a record of all the changes that you make. And if you want to publish in many journals today, you'll need to have that in order to show, to make the data, I guess, the data manipulation reproducible. So that's how we did that. We started out with, as I said, something like 1.9 million specimen records. We refined our study area to the southeast mainland, and then we corrected the higher classifications, which are not always filled in, removed cryptogams. And we still had 1.3 million records, which is pretty good. But then we started to filter out to correct taxonomy. We included records later than 1950. The reviewers sort of insisted on that one. Corrected a lot of geocodes, dealt with spatial uncertainty and many other problems. And we ended up with 730,000 records. But that does tell you that there are a lot of records in these data that need cleaning prior to use. All right, well, once we got to that point, at least we had some good clean data where we were fairly convinced that we had reliable species distributions. And we broke that down and estimated the impact of the fires on these species in 3 different ways. We use the point data itself, which can be useful for rare species, particularly because most populations of those are known. We also used a simple process of binning the data to try to reduce spatial collecting bias, which is a known problem with herbarium specimen records. And then we did a range of different species distribution modeling techniques, mostly entirely using Maxent, but with different thresholds for inclusion. So I'm not going to get into all the details there, but we developed those and then we overlaid our fire maps onto those. And we spat out a series of metrics that allowed us to estimate the impact of the fires on our different species. So I'm just going to spend just a couple minutes to talk about those. And you can read about this, but basically what we found was that, as you would expect, given such a large area, we had more than 800 species that had at least 50% of their ranges or populations burnt. And obviously there'll be a lot of plant families represented, 76. But as you would expect, Myrtaceous, Fabaceous species were dominant. I mean, those are the most specious families in the region. It's not terribly surprising. Now, most species, though, were found in sclerophyll vegetation, also not surprising, given that most of the fires occurred in sclerophyll vegetation. There were actually a surprisingly small number of rainforest taxa that had half of their ranges burnt. There were 24 that you would probably call strictly rainforest taxa, subject to further work on these species. There were also a small number of families that are considered to be Gondranadan relics. I'm no expert on such things, but what I understand, these are important families from a conservation and, I guess, taxonomic perspective in Australia. So most species, I think the results of this study really show that most species that we found are to be severely impacted are components of vegetation that burn regularly. It's not surprising, I guess, but there are certainly a small number of rainforest taxa that you might want to be concerned about, and particularly cool temperate rainforest. Now, Nothofagus murray, which is a keystone species in cool temperate high altitude rainforests in New South Wales, was actually not among those species. And it is lucky that there were a few regions of these rainforests that were not affected by the fires. But getting away from just the compositional, I guess, attributes of the species that were affected, I thought that there were some interesting aspects of the ranges of the species that's been overlooked. As you would expect, it was the species that had half of their ranges burnt or more were heavily skewed towards taxa with small ranges. There are more than almost 100 species with ranges less than 10 kilometers across. And many of those are quite rare, but but the fires are probably not unprecedented for those taxa, because the scale of those species and their ranges is smaller than fires that occur fairly regularly. It doesn't have to be a megafire to burn most of those populations. Many were burnt, for instance, during the Victorian fires in the 2000s. I think more interesting, and I'm not ruling out that there aren't some examples of species that can be quite significantly affected that are rare, but what was notable was that there was more than 100 species that had ranges that were 500 kilometers across, at least, and up to 1,500 kilometers across, that are endemic to the region and that had more than half of their ranges burnt. Now, that is greatly bigger than even the biggest megafires, and could only occur in a season where you had multiple fires up and down the coast. I think for those species, the fires were particularly unprecedented, because you're talking about potentially shifting a population primarily of older individuals to, seedling recruits, or species that are trying to recover via resprouting, and so on. So you can imagine that there's a potential for herbivory or disease or drought to play a very important role in the post-bushfire recovery of those specific species. So while people focus on rare taxa, I think it's important to acknowledge these widespread things which probably have never experienced, or at least for centuries, such an event. And I'm just going to finish off on one other slide here for you. A little bit of a nod out to the orchids again. We identified a range of different groups of species that we think are likely to be affected more than others by the fires. Particularly fire non-responders, so species that are generally killed by the fires themselves or their hosts, and species which lack residual seed bank or some sort of post-fire flowering event or so on. And among those, I think epiphytes are actually probably the most at risk. There's a few other taxa as well, but we've identified a number of epiphytic orchids in northern New South Wales. They are rainforest species, many of them. They already were quite restricted. On the left, you can see in the little, you can see grid cells which had burnt populations of those taxa, up to 4 in individual grid cells. And on the right, you can see in blue the areas of those taxa that were not burnt. So the remaining populations of many of these orchids are fragmented, small in scale, and very much restricted now to places like the Nightcap Ranges, Barrington Tops, and areas east of, or to the west of Bellingen. So they're quite restricted. Many of them are rare, and I think that these are some species that people might want to have a look at. We've been promoting this idea in over the last few weeks to maybe do some work on those taxa, which were not identified by other groups who have been doing similar work. I'm not sure why that is, but we picked up at least 6 such species. So just a final slide on conclusions. I hope that I've given you some insight into why I think that these extreme events can play a sort of a crucial and unique role in driving ecosystem change. It's interactions between such events that I think are particularly critical. I would expect to see an increase in bottom-up population decline as droughts become more severe in the future. And there's an opportunity, I think, to delve a little bit more into how the big drought before the fires may actually be now influencing the recruitment and recovery of so many species in the fire-affected areas. And not to discount the impact of the fires, certainly immense in scale, many species affected. I think a fairly small percentage of those that are non-persisters are particularly at risk. And I think that there's some demographic work needed on species with large ranges that would not have faced such an event in the past. So thanks very much for the help, and just another shout out to my colleague Nunzio, who really is the brains behind all the coding and so much of the work that was done here. Thanks very much.